So I think you all know what a survey is. You've seen surveys. Let me show you an example of a survey that I developed for work here. That is a modern thing called Question Pro. Question Pro is just like SurveyMonkey or that. So in a survey, you start off by introducing what it is that you want to know about, and this is my office, Office of Research and Faculty Affairs, and we were doing a survey of the professors about what kind of services they wanted help with. So, and now I seem to screw up whatever it is I was trying to show you. Okay. 1 second. There we go. Okay, so the idea of the survey, you ask a standardized question, and for your quiz, you need to know that we use standardized measures whenever possible. So you have closed-ended questions. So like, which of the following services would be valuable to you? And we list them. And you can only choose from that list. If it's not on the list, you can choose other, perhaps, but we need kind of an exhaustive list of everything. Any idea why we would ask a closed-ended question instead of just an open-ended question? Right. Exactly. So if you give open-ended, everyone's going to respond in a way that's not comparable. And by doing it this way, I can say that 75% of professors want the first service, 61% want the second, 40% want the third. So it allows me to come up with better graphics. And I'll show you the graphics it comes up with later. So it gives us comparable answers across people. And so whenever possible, if we can come up with a comparable way to respond, it's good. And so you can ask these kind of multiple choice questions, and that's a multiple answer option. You can put a slider bar, like how strongly do you feel about something? In this case, how important is the service for you? And by putting it on a scale here, it allows me to come up with a number between 0 and 100, and they can kind of get a relative rank of what's more or less important to them, right? The value of this is it's now a ratio level variable that I can do all kinds of fancy math with and talk about averages and compare these kinds of things. So we come up with fancy ways of asking in a standardized way that gives us a scoreable number. And then we do have some open-ended ones, like do you have any comments about anything mentioned above? So they could answer something more specific if they wanted to. But in general, we want it to be standardized as much as possible. And then the reason we did this is because now by doing this, I can see the results. I sent it out to 31 people, and 23 of them responded. They spent 3 minutes each, and it's going to give me kind of a breakdown and some graphs about what they felt was the most important. So I can show my boss, look, this tells us right away what services are the most important based on this pie chart or this bar chart, right? And on that slider scale, this is showing the average. So 23 people, it's giving me one number that makes sense across all 23 people. So a lot of data come out like this, and it's easy to report, easy to reference. And for the open-ended questions, we can see that we did get some answers there, but only a couple of people. Out of the 23 people that filled out the closed-ended questions, only 5 put anything in the text box, and what they put was all kind of not comparable stuff. So qualitative and quantitative don't always mix, either one way or the other. When you try to mix it, it doesn't work. Okay, so for your quiz, you need to know that surveys are very versatile in that you can ask questions on nearly any topic. So the strength of a survey is how versatile it is, and that social survey research collects information from a sample of individuals through the responses to standardized questions. So it's true that we use standardized questions whenever possible. The more you can standardize it, the better off you are. So Surveys are quantitative. You ask some predetermined questions, but one of the challenges, you can't change your mind. Once people start answering the survey, that's it. I realized later, my boss got mad. I left out a question, but it's too late. Can't make any change. For qualitative methods, you can often go back and add later. You can just find the same person and ask them more, but for quantitative, it's anonymous. So I don't know who said what, and I can't go back and change anything. But it's versatile in the sense you can work on any topic, and it's standardized. Now, what kind of response rate do you think we need to be good? If I only had one person answer the survey out of the 32, that would be bad, right? But is 10 enough? 20? Do I need all the people to do so? Yeah, it'd be good to have all, but real world, we often get more like 10% is kind of common for surveys that are sent out through the mail, such. So according to your book and for your test, you need to know that 75% response rate is what's needed in order to be confident that the results will be representative of the population. That's what your book says, 75%. That would be true if you have 75% response rate. In reality, we rarely get above 50%. It's rare. The survey that I did, I had a 75% response rate, but that's among people that work here and they know me, so it should be 100%. But even in a perfect situation where we're literally paying the people to do so, and they hopefully like me enough to help me out and fill out the survey, I still only got 75% response rates under ideal circumstances. And I gave them like 2 weeks to do it with many reminders. So yeah. So we use it to explain trends or features of large groups. We can, if we interview the same people again and again and again, it doesn't happen often, but should you have the same people interviewed again and again, it's called longitudinal. We'll see that later on in here. So longitudinal, you're tracking people, the same person over time, and ask them to take the survey again and again. But typically what we do is what's called cross-sectional. So cross-sectional means one person, one time, and you only get them once. You can do it again with different people, but you have different cross-sections. And most of our understanding about trends and social trends, what's happening, is cross-sectional studies that are compared. So here we go. So cross-sectional, administered just once. And this is, most surveys are like this because it's hard to track people again. And getting them to cooperate the first time is hard. Getting them to cooperate the second time is ever harder. But you can ask them retrospective questions about their past. And I used to work a little bit in diet research, and there we'd ask, like, what did you eat for breakfast yesterday? What did you eat for lunch yesterday? What did you eat dinner? That kind of thing. You can ask them about the past, but they're not going to remember as well as things in the present. But most surveys are cross-sectional, one time. That said, that's a weakness in that if we compare one cross-sectional survey to another cross-sectional survey that asks the same questions at a different time, it could be that the samples were different enough that they can't be compared. Only if you have a large sample of 75% response rate can we assume, and you had the random selection of participants, then we can assume that they're, so the other word, longitudinal. Longitudinal is administered over an extended period of time. So when I was a PhD student, when I tracked this data set that every 2 years followed the same people, and they were looking at their aging process. So every 2 years they were tracked and asked the same questions again, and we could draw lines and see whether their health was stable, getting worse, or improving. And so that's a trend. We could look at different subgroups. And so, like, I found that people that were highly educated were living longer over time, and people that had lower levels of education were living shorter lives, because it turns out the world's really hard if you don't have good pay and health insurance and all the benefits of the good pay brings usually. So a panel, I don't think this is on your test, but panel is the idea that you it's a group of people you're tracking again and again. There's in the news, they talk about this thing called the term and termite study that tracked kids when they were young and then tracked them when they were older. And let's see if it's going to let me open it. So this is the ultimate longitudinal study. For 75 years, still tracking geniuses. So, it's not going to let me. Okay. So in 1921, Dr. Lewis Terman, Stanford psychology pioneer of the IQ tests, scoured California schools to identify 1,500 children who scored 135 or higher on the IQ test. Little geniuses who the study went along calling themselves termites because his name was Terman, and I thought that was funny. They're now in their 80s, and they've been contacted by researchers every 5 or 10 years, making the Terman study of geniuses the grandfather of all lifespan research. I mean, this is a longitudinal study, and these things are rare. But we can tell a lot about how intelligence and the benefits that intelligence brings, usually good paying jobs, how it affects health. And we can compare the people in this study to other studies like the General Social Survey and find some new results. Anyways, this is the example of longitudinal study. Typically, they all have the same qualifications called a cohort. Typically, the word cohort means born in the same generation, but in research, it's like participate in the study in the same time period. If you work in research, you'll hear the word cohort a lot. And for the MSW program, we have a cohort model you might hear about. That's the only way you can finish your MSW without there being distractions. If you're in the cohort, you take all the classes with the same people again and again and again, and they guarantee they'll offer the courses. If you're not in the cohort, then they might cancel the class on you, and then you might not be able to graduate on time. Interesting quirk of UTA. So when we do surveys, you can just take it yourself at your own time, like the Question Pro survey I did. That's self-administered. I send you an email link, and you do it whenever you want to. You can do it in a group, so I can just hand a paper survey to everyone in the classroom. That's the old way of doing things. Many times those ways are in person. Major surveys, like television ratings, the Nielsen ratings, are by mail, or nowadays probably online, and or you can have someone with a clipboard at the grocery store asking questions. Each of these is give you a different response rate. Typically, by mail, it's going to give you something like a 5% response rate. I don't know if you guys ever got something in the mail where like they attach a quarter or put $1 in the envelope or something like that to increase the response rate. That's an incentive. That typically doubles the response rate over what you would get without there being an incentive. So by mail and online, sometimes there's like a raffle for a gift card, right? In fact, just today, I was asked to print out a flyer for a research study. And I'll just give you a sense of the incentives. Opens up. So this is looking for people to participate in a research study on Alzheimer's disease. And if you participate, you'll get a $75 Amazon gift card. And if your family member helps you, they'll get a $50 gift card. So, so if you know anyone with Alzheimer's, you can pass this along and you get $125 right there. So we have grants to do this, and we need to pay this much because we're going to ask you to fill out a questionnaire, and it takes a lot of time, and then we're going to follow up with you again later and such. So this is pretty typical kind of thing, and before we can offer these kind of incentives, the IRB has to review and make sure it's not an amount that's coercive and ensure that the amount is both not too little for the amount of time and not too much to be kind of force people into the study. So I mean, this increases the response rate. By putting up a flyer like this, you know, maybe 1% of people would respond, but anyone who knows someone that qualifies with that kind of money on the line, you'll get a much higher response rate. So when we're writing effective questions, you'll need to know that you, of course, have to know what the topic is you're studying, decide what it is you want to know, so that you can ask the questions in the right way. You want to keep the questions clear and to the point without any lack of clarity, which you'll see in a moment, some examples of that. You want to make sure that the questions you're asking are relevant to the participants that are there. So you really got to know that population and the level of language that they understand and the topics that they understand. Typically we use filters, so if it's a topic that only applies to women, for example, if it's a question about menopause or something, we would, that's a filter where you ask them their gender first and then ask them the question related to the gender after that. This idea of double negatives, I have some examples. Let me bring up the example of double negative. Okay. So these are some examples of some bad questions, and they have, let's start off with the first one here. Do you feel like the limited actions used by the government to control COVID-19 were effective? It's called a leading question, right? By placing judgment in the beginning. So this is a leading question. By asking it this way, you're more likely to get more no's. If you took out the word limited, you're more likely to get fewer no's, right? So depending on how you ask the question, if you have any kind of leading aspect to it, it'll affect the response rate. Next one, should parents allow their children to have smartphones and use social media? This is called a double-barreled question. We're asking two different questions at once, and smartphones is one thing, social media is another. So it should be divided into two questions. And so this is the idea of a double-barreled question, two ideas. The next question about what flavor pizza do you like? It's not a bad question, but it depends on how you ask. Flavor is not even the right word, right? Maybe like what toppings do you like on it? And if you gave options, that would be comparable. If you kept it open-ended, you might get comparable answers. You probably get a lot of pepperonis and things like that, but you might not get comparable answers. What is your opinion about climate change? That's an interesting question, but it's so open-ended that it's not likely to get you the answers that you are expecting, right? You get a lot of, I don't know. So you need to sometimes be more specific. Too broad is not helpful. Schools should not be allowed to not reopen. So that's a double negative question, okay? They should not be allowed to not reopen. With the double negative, no one has any idea what you're referring to. You gotta think backwards. So this is a double negative, not to be allowed to not reopen, something like that. And next one, how many calories do you consume when you eat breakfast? This is the kind of question people don't know. Unless that's their life is counting calories, typically you have no idea. So that's the idea of asking a question that your audience would be familiar with. Athletes might know, but typically that's not something to get at this, you'd ask them, what did you eat for breakfast? And you can retroactively calculate what the calories might have been based on that. Next one, is logistic regression preferable to phenomenological analysis, or would repeated measures ANOVA with the between subjects analysis be a better option? I understand what that means, but that's all jargon. That's all statistics words. So, if you're in a group of statisticians, they'll know exactly what that means. So if you're surveying statisticians, good. But if people aren't statisticians, it's called the jargon. These are all words that only experts would be familiar with in that area. So again, this is about know your audience and avoiding jargon where it's inappropriate. Next one, why do you think drinking alcohol is bad for you? This is a leading question unto itself, right? Because you would want to ask them, do you think alcohol is bad or good for your health? Are you taking any medications? Depends on how you're answering it, but yes and no is okay. So that's the idea of that. So here on this slide be avoid confusion. So double negatives, you know what that means. Two no's or two nots. Jargon is technical words. Double-barreled is asking two questions at once. And so when we design surveys, we pilot it, which means we test it out in a smaller group of people first, and we do our best to empathize with people taking a survey to get their perspective, and we try to get feedback from that sample group. One way we can do that is something called cognitive interviewing. And with cognitive interviewing, this is a process that we test out a question. So to evaluate the survey questions before they're offered to millions of people, we have different variations of it, and we start off with a purposive sample selection, which you guys hopefully remember what that means. You're specifically finding people that meet certain criteria, right? Because the goal is to identify the presence of a problem as opposed to making estimations or causal statements. So we start off with a purposive sample of people that are familiar with the topic that we're studying. And we take a qualitative approach where people are analyzing the question, typically 20 to 50 people. And we're testing each question in the survey for comprehension. So asking them whether they understand each of the words in the survey. And so a word like abdomen that scientists may use may not be used by average people. We're ask them a question and we ask a little bit later, did you remember what question you were asked? Or see, do you even remember what the question is asking you? Does it make sense? And how sure people are about their answer, and how do they pick the answer? So typically, every question that's on a major survey has been tested like this through a detailed interview of the 20 to 50 people. And so we find based on this that people don't always interpret the questions the same way as we had thought. Often turn out to have a stronger opinion than we think, but not exactly as we were expecting. So again, the questions should be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So the options should all make sense and only be asking one thing. And we need to have a way to address people that are on the fence about how they feel about an issue. So there are some social issues for which you just don't care. It's not your issue. So one of the response options needs to be not applicable. And if you don't have that not applicable, people will just pick an answer and they might give you an answer that will confuse you later on. Because you want to give people an option to say that it's not applicable to them. So that's sitting on the fence is the not applicable response. Floating, sometimes if you have an other response, you'll find that people say, oh, it depends on the circumstances. So and give people the option that they can add a little bit more detail with an other answer is sometimes helpful. Anchors is an interesting concept. With anchors, some topics like pain, we all have a totally different perception of, like what's painful, right? Or what's spicy. So if you're doing a survey about spicy foods and its effect on your memory or something like that, to get at anchors, you're going to ask several questions in the beginning that give examples of specific spicy foods to let people rate how spicy they think that is. And so anchor gives you a chance to figure out what range that person is relating to. Spicy food is the best example because people may have a very different opinion about what spicy means. Often pain or depression. Also, we have different expectations. We can ask them questions to get at the anchor of what's normal to them. Open-ended questions allow for more individual nuance, more individual variability, but it doesn't always give you usable results. But sometimes we'll sprinkle in a few to make that possible. Standardized instruments means we're using closed-ended questions and scales like the depression scale, the PHQ-9, things like that. Whenever possible, that allows us to compare what your data to what other studies have found. So when we're designing a survey, we try to group together related questions together. So if you're going to have 20 questions, you want there to be a flow to the survey. Typically, we want it to be within 5 minutes. Anything longer than 5 minutes or so, people give up. So just like telling a story, you want it to make sense as you're going about it. So there should be some order. And typically, we're building up. We start off with general things about you and get more and more specific as you get further in. We try to make it look nice, colorful in some way, and sometimes vary the way we ask the questions. Like the example I showed earlier, I had some options and some slider bars that try to make it more interesting. You want to pre-test it with people, so a small group of people that you know to give you feedback whether they understood the questions and have any response interpretations that are different than you expect. So if we think about social work practice, any assessment that you do on someone is basically a survey. And it's a survey of one person, and you score it typically in some way, and you're comparing their score to some expectation, right? And if they score high on like a propensity to violence or something like that, then you know you can take action. If they score low, then you can't. So a lot of social work interventions were based on surveys or studies that showed a statistical association between a certain score and a certain outcome. And so when we're doing an assessment of a client, it's really a survey of one person, and we're scoring it and comparing it to what a larger population studies have found to identify people that are at risk of certain needs, risk of homelessness, of violence, of neglect, whatever the issue may be. And now when we think about issues around diversity, it should be considered in survey research. This is the issue that culture can play a role in interpreting some results, but also the base data that we have to make decisions on is not always based on the culture that we're studying. And with surveys, we often assume that everyone is similar. We're all kind of in this simulated world where we're all living in the same culture, and in reality, we come from very diverse backgrounds, families. Each of us has something unique. And so surveys don't necessarily completely predict, and assessments don't always predict outcomes as well as we might have hoped. So a lot of work goes into surveys, and it's easy to publish surveys because you end up with data that applies to a lot of people. It's not hard to get thousands of people to answer a survey, particularly an online survey. Such. So let me look at our quiz today and make sure that I've addressed all the topics. And where is it? It is here.